The Trump administration does not appreciate the hard work that has gone into the building of this relationship over the 3 decades. Over the last few weeks, India and China have actually undertaken a reset in their relationship, which is a fairly significant reset. China holds much greater leverage when it comes to negotiating with the United States.
Trump's 50% tariffs on India have kicked in. That means Americans importing Indian goods will pay among the highest tariffs in the world. Amitendu Palit of the National University of Singapore's Institute for South Asian Studies joins me now. Thank you very much for taking the time for us today. So until recently, the US was India's largest trading partner. Can you describe the impact that these tariffs will have on the Indian economy?
Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. It's actually a very interesting point in time insofar as looking at things from outside is concerned. So you're right. The United States has been India's largest export partner, and that is a relationship which has been there for quite some time. The US, more importantly than being a largest trade partner, is a country which is the largest destination for India's exports. So roughly, while numbers vary, on an average, we can see some $65 billion of Indian goods being exported to the United States every year. And that would be a little more than, I would say, around 15% of India's total exports to the rest of the world, maybe. The point that I think which becomes critical at this stage is that with a 50% tariff that has now come in, how much of the Indian exports to the American market are going to get affected? There are some sectors which are definitely going to be pretty highly affected. And I think among these, I'll specifically mention the garments. I'll mention the leather and leather products. I'll also mention certain other items like handmade carpets, gems and jewelry, even some machinery which are going to get affected. There are two other sectors which are big exports for India to the United States. These are refined petroleum products and pharmaceuticals. Now, pharmaceuticals till now are not coming under the 50% tariffs. Refined petroleum products are coming, but before we get down to actually understanding the nitty-gritties of these tariffs and their long-term impact, there's a lot of confusion that still exists in terms of what exactly will be the implication, because it is not just reciprocal tariffs of 25% that has come on India, along with the Russian penalty tariffs of 25%. There are also Section 232 product-specific tariffs that are weighing on India, though the Russian penalty tariff order says that Section 232 tariffs that are existing on steel and aluminium, along with automobiles and auto parts, are not going to be stacked up against the current tariffs that are coming. But the fact of the matter remains that a large number of Indian export items will be attracting a combination of 25 plus 25, 50% tariffs into the American market. And that clearly makes a lot of Indian exports in the sectors that I mentioned a little while ago, garments, textiles, leather, and gems and jewelry, carpets, and certain other machinery items, they certainly make them much less competitive in the American market. So to that extent, there will be some setbacks, at least in the short term, for these sectors.
Okay, so we're talking about $48 billion worth of Indian exports, about 55% of the exports to the US being directly affected by these tariffs, which is also around about the size of India's trade surplus with the US. And we'll go into India's reaction in a moment. But first, maybe you could explain how we got here. So India and the US were locked in negotiations, even for years, going back before these tariffs as well. But those have now failed, at least for now. So maybe you could explain a bit of the background as to how we got here.
You're absolutely right. In fact, India and the United States were actually cruising along quite well till about, I would say, the last 2.5 months. Let me just briefly share the background as well, that the government of India was one of the earliest to get going on negotiating a bilateral trade deal with the United States once the Trump 2.0 began. In fact, it was as early as in February that the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in Washington. And on the occasion of his visit, the two countries announced a joint statement, and the joint statement mentioned that both countries would work on getting the first tranche of a bilateral trade agreement prepared by the fall of 2025, so which is expectedly around August, September of this year. Now, that was coming in the background of a context which clearly demonstrated that India was a very strong strategic partner of the United States. And this is a relationship which has grown over the last 30 years in areas of technology, defense, as well as various aspects of economic cooperation and people to people movement. The India US cooperation has been really, really strong. And probably that was something which, going into the trade negotiations, had given Indian negotiators the confidence that while trade might be a difficult subject to reach an agreement on, India would, given the totality of its strategic commitment and engagement with the US, India would be in a better position than most other countries to actually negotiate a deal with the US, even if there might be some red lines which would be difficult to negotiate, such as on agriculture and so on and so forth. But I think as we went ahead, and if we particularly look at the time after the reciprocal tariffs were announced on the 2nd of April, I think three factors went into complicating the negotiations. The first was the India-Pakistan hostilities that followed the very tragic assassination of a number of Indian tourists in the Indian state of Kashmir at around the third week of April earlier this year. And then the fact that that escalated into a military conflict between India and Pakistan, which did not go on for too long, but it was the American president who claimed to have actually brokered a ceasefire between the two countries. Now, this is a claim which India has repeatedly denied. The president has claimed so repeatedly, India has denied so repeatedly. And it was obvious that, the two sides were not speaking in the same voice. So this was a major point of discord. And then subsequently, two other factors went into complicating the context of the negotiations. One was that probably in the United States calculation, there was not really a proximate end to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And this was in contrast to the hopes which the president had when he took office and when he had claimed that he will be able to put an end to the war quite quickly. But since that was not happening, I think the focus shifted to actually, single out those countries which have large purchases of Russian energy and bring down, the axe on them to make sure that Russian revenues get affected and the war effort, the war financing effort gets damaged. And the third point was that the coalition of the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which has now expanded to include many more other countries. The BRICS group has, over the last few months, turned out to be decisively anti-American in the perspective of the US president. And the fact that India was a prominent member of the BRICS, in addition to the fact that India, or for that matter, the BRICS, never really took out a position to address this anti-Americanism idea on part of the President Trump, must have riled the US president. And I'm mindful of the fact that the Rio summit of the BRICS, which happened early, July, was a summit which produced a communique that was very strongly critical of all the policies that the Trump administration was adopting, particularly on trade. And that wouldn't have really softened the attitude on part of the US. So I think these three factors were actually those which went into serious consideration of India being singled out for large tariffs. This, apart from the fact that there are certain red lines in the trade negotiations, which I'm quite sure India was not prepared to cross. or maybe the price that the United States wanted in return for India was really very significant, something that India was not really prepared to accept. And perhaps India was also not getting what it wanted from the United States in terms of reciprocal market access. So much so that, the matters really did not get into the point of mutual resolution at any stage.
I want to pick up on what you were saying there about the oil imports from Russia, that the US wishes to punish India for. About 42% of India's crude oil imports are coming from Russia now. Pre-war, it was less than 1%. So clearly, they are going against something which is a goal for the United States. You can see why the US is putting pressure on there. But on the other hand, other countries such as China that are importing Russian oil are not being punished on the same terms as India is. Why do you think this is happening? Is there a motive beyond merely wanting to reduce what Russia is sending to India?
That's actually a very interesting question. I think India has been unfortunate in getting caught in a kind of crossfire. And let me explain what I'm trying to say. You're absolutely right in saying the kind of purchases that you assign for both China and India. Both are heavy buyers of Russian oil. But China hasn't been addressed on the tariffs. India has been. And I think that is also a result of the fact that China holds much greater leverage when it comes to negotiating with the United States. When I say leverage, I basically address to the fact that China is in a position to geo-economically handle the United States better in terms of certain resources that it has over control, such as the rare earths and critical minerals. And throughout this trade saga, China is one country of the world which has retaliated against the United States. It has shown very clearly that as far as the United States unilateral actions are concerned, it is not going to take those lying down. It is going to come back with tit for tat, back-to-back tariffs. If there are export controls that the United States imposes on export of chips to China, China would retaliate by putting similar restrictions on export of rare earths. Now, which essentially means that in the geoeconomic power hierarchy, China enjoys that advantage, which they are able to exert in gaining a leverage with the US. And let's not forget that China and the United States right now are in a truce period of 90 days. They're actually negotiating or trying to negotiate a deal between them. India does not have that degree of leverage as China does. And I would probably think that in a broader sense, there are issues, like, say, for example, the India-Pakistan ceasefire that I alluded to, and the claim that President Trump has been making for taking credit for blocking it. And also issues like, the BRICS and so on and so forth in a much more prominent manner. Now, these are issues with which India has been identified that much more. There's nothing further that the US can basically bring against China. I mean, that arsenal has been completely exhausted. And the US sanctions and the prohibitive actions are not really producing much of results. Now, with respect to India, I'm not saying that it has produced results, but the difference that you see for India is that India is yet to retaliate. And it is, taking a position of waiting and watching while making it very clear that it is not going to compromise on what it considers are its strategic interests, national interests. So it is going to continue buying Russian oil. And the point that I'd like to make in this regard is that there was a time around 2 years ago when the United States itself had been supportive of India's buying of Russian oil for the very simple reason that that purchase was handling the volatility in the global crude oil markets. And India has been refining the crude oil, which has been going out to the rest of the world, including to Europe, including to the United States. So I think for India, this is really a very perplexing issue as to why when all the fundamentals were logically correct, did suddenly the Trump administration decide to do with India what it has? And I suppose one is eventually drawn to the conclusion that there are no real strategic or other strong geopolitical factors that has influenced the decision. It's basically some personal understanding of India in a way which has impacted this decision. I mean, a parallel can probably be done to or drawn to what is happening with Brazil, which has been slapped with 50% tariffs just because President Trump has a particular view of the former Brazilian President Bolsonaro. And, and he's unhappy with the way the current Brazilian administration is going about his trial. So Brazil has been slapped 50% tariffs. So clearly that's something which has nothing to do with trade, which has nothing to do with any other strategic factors. And I suspect in India's case, it might just have been something like that. The Russian energy pursuit might just have been an excuse, to take the opportunity to come hard at India.
Mm. Yeah, so it's a fulcrum which Trump is using in order to put pressure on India. And I should say, it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention, as a European broadcaster, that many European countries are still taking Russian energy as well in the form of LNG. So it's not as if Europe is not doing what it's telling other countries not to do. Something to keep in the back of our minds anyway. But one of the sticking points for Trump was market access when it comes to agriculture, dairy, poultry in India. Modi has said there will be no compromise on farmers. And Modi is doubling down on his call for Swadeshi, so homegrown goods for local consumption. How much is that likely to resonate with Indians?
I think let me address this question in this respect that there are certain red lines that India has as far as market access is concerned. And clearly parts of the agricultural sector are included in those red lines. Now, that is not an exception in any respect, because I think there are other countries, for example, if you look at Japan and Korea and even the United States, there are agricultural sensitivities with respect to opening up those sectors. In India's case, very specifically, I think dairy is one of those sectors where India has always been reluctant to allow market access as far as foreign imports are concerned. And there are reasons for which India doesn't want to allow market access. Now, one might agree with those, one may disagree with those. But I think the point to be noted over here is that it is not just agriculture or these sensitivities which actually led to the current conditions that we are witnessing. See, if I could go back again to what I mentioned at the beginning, that the joint statement issued in February between the government of India and the government of the US mentioned about a first tranche of a bilateral investment deal. Now, if you look at India's trade negotiations, trade history, you will see that there are deals which have had their first editions followed by later editions. Very recently, India has finished a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. It is in a very advanced stage of negotiating a free trade agreement with the European Union. Now, one of the points that I would like to mention in this regard is that what we are getting to see with the United States, the deals that various countries are signing, including European Union, these are not exactly free trade agreements. These are just nothing much more than buy and sell agreements. They're coming out on executive orders. Any free trade agreement the United States signs has to come through the Congress, given the constitutional provisions. These things are not even getting to go anywhere close to the Congress. They're just coming out of executive orders from the White House. So I wouldn't consider them free trade agreements. I would merely call them bilateral purchase and sale agreements in terms of what the countries are allowing on market access and what they're committing to buy from the United States or invest in the United States. In that respect, if we shift to a free trade agreement like the one that India has signed with the United Kingdom, I think it's one of the most generous free trade agreements that India has ever signed without compromising on what it would consider are the reddest of the red lines, if I can put it that way. So, for example, a sector like dairy has still been kept protected. There are one or two sections of the government procurement market which have been protected, not opened up. Other than that, most of the services and manufacturing sectors have been opened up. The interesting point is that a country like the United Kingdom has not really objected to this because there are sensitivities that all countries have. The European Union also similarly is happy to get market access into India. The negotiations have been hard and strong, but after a point in time, I think countries understand that large countries or large regions or large blocks do have areas in their space of negotiation which are not easy to give up on as they go ahead. This is something which I think India expected from the United States because the United States similarly have red lines in its own domestic market access issues, which they're not going to give up. So if those negotiations cannot respect and take note of certain specific sensitivities that are socially, politically, and economically very important for those countries, these cannot go on. And when it comes to the current posturing of India that you mentioned, see, one of the important points that India now has to work on is look at a strategy. And that strategy, following the setback of its exports in the American market, will need to focus on two aspects. One of them is diversification to other markets. And I'm actually thinking of the United Kingdom FTA or the EU FTA or certain other big country FTAs. Perhaps the one with Canada also will now come into force. This could be some of the markets where the products will be diversified, the ones that are finding it difficult to access the American market. But the other part of the strategy is also to make these particular sectors which have been affected to focus a little bit more closely on the domestic market. So much so that they are able to address the demand in the domestic market larger and faster. Now, this in terms of policy is certainly a well-intentioned effort. The issue over here is whether the producers who were aligned to sell to foreign markets and to a market like the United States will actually be able to reposition their products as quickly as possible and as fast as possible for the domestic market and other markets. My sense is that over here we are probably going to see some demands coming out from the exporter lobbies and exporter organizations of greater financial support from the government in order to take care of their current setbacks and repositioning of strategies. So we can expect some government financial packages to be announced to this effect to enable them to correct their stance. And this is going to be similar to certain other countries who are also announcing the same.
Yeah, so it looks like, talking about the exporters, there could be a 20 to 30% drop in Indian exports to the US, which, and of course this is just a forecast, a prediction at the moment, could lead to a 0.8% decline in annual growth in GDP, in Indian GDP. And of course, some of those measures that you've mentioned that Modi might want to take could include slashing taxes to stimulate growth, or even devaluing the rupee. But do you think those and the other measures, some of which you touched on, will be enough to stave off the economic hit?
You know, on the macro level projections, I just wanted to share that if one looks at the projections from the Reserve Bank of India, which is one of the foremost agencies in India projecting economic growth and preparing macroeconomic strategy in line with the economic growth. The Reserve Bank of India still is holding on to a 6.5% rate of growth in GDP as the forecast which it had made before the tariffs had come in. So probably it thinks that the impact of these export setbacks is not going to be significant. The second is that I think if we look at the credit rating scenarios that have come out with respect to India, the sovereign credit ratings from Fitch and the Standard and Poor, they continue to maintain India's rating, the currency ratings, as stable. Yes, there is clearly going to be some impact on the export revenues. Now, I'm not exactly sure whether that would mean a 0.8 percentage point drop in the GDP or not. But you know, I am one of those who who would be inclined to the view that the Indian economy is one of those economies which has a very large domestic market and also a very significant informal sector. And there's a great amount of ability of the economy to generate new economic activities internally. So while on one side we might see some industries suffering as a result of the problems that they are facing in the American market, there are some other sectors which are clearly going to probably prosper and benefit. Because the situation around India and Asia and the rest of the world after these tariffs is quite complicated. So it's not just that different countries have been slapped with different tariffs. There are also new transshipment tariffs. All countries are facing difficulties with respect to the United States because the de minimis threshold on small value parcels entering into the United States free of customs duties has been withdrawn. Now, that means that even if the tariff rate that a country, let's say, for example, like Vietnam faces, which could be much lower than that of India, it's still going to have to face tariffs on the small value purchase. There's going to be a lot of readjustment in the supply chains. There's going to be a lot of readjustment among the currencies across the world. And finally, there's one point that I would like to share, and I think this is something which has not got as much attention as it requires. There's a strong part of the India-US trade which actually is growing in a very robust way and which has not been affected by tariffs at all. That is the India-US trade in services. It is in the United States' interest to maintain these services because the United States is a net exporter of services with respect to India. It runs a trade surplus over there. There's a huge amount of revenue that the US service companies enjoy from India, particularly the tech companies. India at this point in time is the world's topmost market when it comes to global capability centers, and they're doing a huge amount of business in India. Most of them are owned by Fortune 500 American companies. So I think there are actors in the United States, particularly among the business groups, the tech companies, and a large number of other similar companies who are actually keen to ensure that this particular economic engagement with India does not get disrupted or disaffected in any way. So I think there will be that effort, perhaps behind the scenes, to make sure that this doesn't go awry under any conditions. I would, at this point in time, not really subscribe to a position where I see a decline in India's economic growth prospects, much as I don't see a huge upliftment in the growth prospects. But I think it's still too early because what will eventually determine the value of this contraction is how the other countries are able to adjust to the American tariffs and the new conditions, and whether finally, the American market itself, in terms of the American consumers, are able to actually absorb these prices, these products at higher prices. Because let's not forget that whatever product from whichever country we are thinking about, they are going to get a minimum tariff of 10% into the American market. So to that extent, the American consumer will have to pay more, number one. Number two, there's the court ruling that is yet to come on the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, under which these tariffs have been issued, the executive order. If that court ruling goes against these tariffs, then it's going to be a very different scenario altogether. We don't really know what to expect in that condition. So I think we'll need to wait and see how this whole drama unfolds.
Yes, I think you're right to question those projections because, of course, Trump could change his mind at any moment. We've seen how flexible he is with the implementation of his tariff policy, at least. You've been very generous with your time, but I'm afraid time is running out for us on our end. So one last question for you, just briefly. What could India do? What concrete measures could it take to retaliate against US tariffs? So far it hasn't, but could it make this hurt for the US?
Frankly, I think at the Indian end right now, the way of thinking is to really wait and see how things develop. Because if one looks at, let's say, for example, the secondary sanctions with respect to Russia. Now, there was a view that the Alaska summit between the US president and the Russian president would provide a way forward, and that would actually mean a change in strategy as far as the US is concerned. Now, that didn't happen. But that does not mean that the line of communication has ended in that respect. So perhaps more are expected from that. Similarly, there is the possibility of the US and China entering into a deal. And once that happens, there might be certain effects coming out from that. And I think let's not lose sight of the fact that over the last few weeks, India and China have actually undertaken a reset in their relationship, which is a fairly significant reset. Prime Minister Modi is going to visit China in a few days from now, and that will be his first visit to China in 7 years. I am expecting that India and China will actually start working closely as far as economic cooperation is concerned. Perhaps we can see more Chinese investments coming into India in certain sectors, which open the field for more jobs, more capital flows, and perhaps more exports from India in a variety of senses. But when it comes to trade retaliation, I don't really think India is thinking of retaliation at this stage, because for India, till now, it is quite important to maintain the commitment to a relationship that it has had with the United States. See, let me put it this way. Perhaps the Trump administration does not understand or does not appreciate the hard work that has gone into the building of this relationship over the 3 decades, and that is why it is prepared to play the spoiler. But India, I think, on its part, is really appreciative of the strength of the relationship that it has with the United States. And it is really not willing to, at least at this point in time, allow certain actions which really are irrational actions as far as India is concerned to spoil the whole tone and content of the relationship, not certainly by doing anything from its side, which reflects, a deviation in commitment from the relationship. So I think India stays committed to the strategic value of its relationship with the United States, that one being one between the world's two largest democracies. I think it values that. It is prepared to wait. It is prepared to talk. It is prepared to negotiate without really complicating the matters from its side, while at the same time thinking of how to bring down its dependency on the American market for exports.
Okay, so in that sense, India is reflecting on its relationship with the US, much like many other countries are at the moment in the world. Amitendu Palit from the National University of Singapore, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you for hosting me.